Hello, I'm Azai. Welcome back to the Fruit Grisaia. I just came back from the gym, and I was a bit scared yesterday, since when I was looking at the recording, I wasn't able to hear my own voice. I was like, oh my god, are you serious? I recorded 2 episodes, and both episodes were like 2 hours long, and I thought that my voice or my recording, at least my mic recording, right, I thought it was all gone. But turns out, I was kind of lucky. The past couple of episodes have been me using Vegas Pro to merge the audio. So, after the audio was merged, the audio from the game and also my voice was actually like just a single audio channel. But turns out yesterday, because I wasn't really editing the recording with Vegas Pro, the audio was separated. And I was doing that because during the H scene, I wanted to cut my own voice. So yeah, I was kind of surprised. But don't worry. Now I don't think I need to merge it with Vegas Pro. I just need to have an audio channel where the game volume and also my mic volume is in the same channel. And after that, I can just mute everything if I need to edit it. Or technically, even if I don't edit it, it should default to the first audio channel, which has both audio. So it should be good. But alright, enough of my ranting. Like I said, I just came back from the gym, and I am ready to record some Grisaia. I think I can do about 3 episodes today. It's still very early in the day, like 4 p.m. I think I can do 3. I think yesterday I was almost scared by the fact that Amane, damn it Amane, she was almost doing some sketchy stuff with Kazuki. But alright. Thankfully, what's her name? Sakuma-senpai? She intervened, thank the Lord. The last few days, both Captain Sakashida... Man, her name is still very awkward for me to say. I am used to Japanese name, but that is a very difficult name to pronounce. And Mr. Ochi had been absent from the camp more often than not. They were supposedly investigating the forest, but we hadn't gotten much specific information about what that involved. With our teacher, the team's official figurehead, and the captain, its true leader, both absent, the majority of the group looked to Kazami Kazuki for orders. To be perfectly honest, there were a considerable number of people who openly scowled at the idea of accepting instructions from an arrogant, sharp-tongued freshman. But by nature, people turn to competence over formal authority in times of crisis. And it was simply a fact that our efficiency as a group increased when command of the camp passed from Captain Sakashida to Kazuki. She carefully assessed everyone's personality and skills and assigned them appropriate jobs, placing a moderate responsibility on every individual's shoulders. Through her consistent distribution of tasks, we had all naturally become aware of our roles, quickly learning to bring certain tasks to certain people without her direct intervention. She'd created a framework that enabled us to be productive. This toilet construction operation was a good example. Kazuki didn't stand on the sidelines directing us, but her initial planning divided us into our teams. One group dug the hole, one group repurposed the chair from the bus into a seat, and one group focused on creating a sturdy roof that wouldn't leak in heavy rain. And she designed a clear procedure for the job, with logical, easy-to-remember steps, carefully tuned to compensate for our small number of workers. Okay, I thought there was going to be something else after that. By following her instructions, we managed to finish the job rather quickly. I'm also realizing that the game volume is a bit louder compared to usual because I wasn't using... Usually I have this background application called Peace. It's basically an application that lets you... what do you call it? Tune? No, not tune. What do you call it? I forgot. Equalize, there you go. It's an equalizer for my headphones, right? So... it can boost the bass, it can lower the bass, it can up the frequency, or not up the frequency, but like put in a couple more decibels on the upper range of the sound. sound waves and stuff like that. But yeah, usually I have that on, and I was wondering why the volume is a bit loud on my OBS when I'm recording. That's why. I don't think it makes too much of a difference though. Besides, I only use that usually when I listen to music, and I'm not really listening to music right now. The completed toilet wasn't much to look at, granted. In fact, it was unmistakably a ramshackle hut slapped together by novice carpenters, but it was functional enough. Of particular note was our makeshift septic tank, filled with gasoline extracted from the bus, as an effective countermeasure against flies, maggots, and other pests. It helped erase our concerns about creating a hub for transmitting disease. If Kazuki hadn't been here, I doubt we could have come up with that idea, much less implemented it. Given such clear displays of competence, even those who dislike Kazuki on a personal level were growing increasingly reliant on her leadership, although in some cases, only grudgingly and out of necessity. Can I stop talking now? Damn it! This is what I realize when we're going through Amane's route. I am talking way too much. There is a shit ton of dialogue that I have to voice out. Not that I mind, I just feel like this is supposed to be a visual novel, right? And it feels too much like a novel instead of a visual novel when I'm talking this much. And it's not me giving my thoughts, it's actually me reading the dialogue. As the sun declined in the west and the fierce heat and humidity finally began to die down, I set about making wheat soup using our meager allocation of rice and the vegetables we'd been able to gather in the forest. Today, the job was far larger than it had been at first. For quite some time, every pair had carefully prepared supper for themselves, probably out of paranoia about the possibility of having some of their food snatched secretly away. But for the last few days, I'd increasingly been assuming the role of the camp cook. Okay. I went along with the new responsibility easily enough. Since I'd been preparing meals for the wounded Hiroka and Sakurai all along, increasing the quantity to feed more of the group wasn't really much of a hassle. I guess everyone finally figured might as well just leave the cooking to the girl who grew up in a restaurant, or something. Probably another effect of Kazuki's emphasis on efficiently dividing our workload. As I struck a fire under the primitive cooking furnace, we'd constructed from moderately sized stones, the various pairs brought forward their mess kits, offering up all the ingredients they had on hand. Apart from the small quantities of rice and vegetables distributed at the beginning of the day, each aluminum rice cooker had a range of unidentifiable weeds and wild grasses picked from the forest. Today, there were quite a number of snails as well. Surprisingly, Komori had gathered most of the small, slimy creatures, and an above-average quantity, although an extremely random assortment, of vegetation to boot. Like, look at this. I am not joking. This is insanity. Like, I think I've been talking for the whole duration of this of this dialogue. It's insane. 8 minutes of me just straight up talking. Holy shit. She'd taken her pet dog into the forest and walked a good ways in, gathering anything that seemed even vaguely edible, then found her way back to the camp without a hitch. Apparently, the dog had memorized the way back by scent. I guess the problem is that it's not that I mind reading this out. It's just the fact that I'm on Amane's perspective. I guess I just dislike Amane so much that I'm having a hard time, you know, like thinking that, Jesus, I have to read out Amane's thoughts this much. Like that. After that first success, Komori made a daily habit of approaching Kazuki with random plants that caught her eye on such trips, asking which might be edible. When night came, our short-sleeved uniforms were, as always, inadequate protection against the chill air. Having finished our dinner, Kazuki and I set off for the large tent and half-forced Hiroka to eat. With that finished, we finally made our way to Captain Sakashira's tent, as we had promised earlier in the day. Trust me, I don't know in the jungle if it's going to be super cold, but in Japan, during summer, if you don't have AC, you are going to be... Ooh, it's really hot. inside of a building anyway. I don't know how it is. Well, I don't know how it is outside. I'd assume it's also not that cold, probably about 28 degrees. She was waiting for us with Koide Senpai inside their tent, where a small candle provided some dim, flickering illumination.
こんばんは。
Oh, thank God, Kazuki. Can I stop talking now? No. I hate you, Amane. Kazuki offered a polite greeting, her tone of voice suggesting she just arrived fashionably late to a high society gathering. Captain Sakashira responded with a curt, "There you are," then glanced at Koide and gave a little jerk of her head, prompting her partner to leave the tent.
どうぞ、入って。
I hate you, Amane, my goodness. Inviting us to sit with a sardonic, "Sorry, I can't offer you any tea." Why can't she just say that? Why do I have to say this? Sorry, it feels like I'm actually impatient by this route, but I am a bit impatient right now because it's insane just how many lines of dialogue I just have to read out. It's insane. Don't you guys think it's insane? I feel like it is. The reason why, like, visual novels are visual novels is because there should be interaction between the characters, not just monologue by the character that we're first personing as. Captain Sakashira got right down to business before we'd even settled ourselves on the ground. Then again, this is Amane's diary. I guess I'm just making excuses. I guess I just hate Amane.
怪我人の様子は？悪化はしていませんが、順調に回復しているとは言えません。そう。
For one thing, Hiroka-san's broken legs wouldn't have fixed themselves in a few days even under ideal circumstances. And Sakurai-senpai's abdominal wound was healing very slowly, thanks to her worsening state of malnutrition and the absence of antibiotics to fight her infection. As an added misery, the intense heat and humidity had left her with a painful skin condition. Even the comparatively light wounded Kaneda's health needed to be monitored closely, given the poor sanitary conditions of the camp. For the last few humid days, she'd been complaining about her wound's constant itchiness. We warned her repeatedly not to scratch, but she had nonetheless picked up a troublesome habit of sticking twigs under her bandage and tearing at her stitches. Oh, that's so disgusting. And apart from those who'd been wounded in the crash, many of the healthy girls were beginning to show increasingly advanced symptoms of malnutrition. Faces were swelling noticeably as our vitamin deficiencies grew more pronounced. Some girls had begun to complain of minor ailments. To be honest, we were past the point of monitoring the situation closely. It was slowly but surely crumbling before our eyes. Captain Sakashira listened to the summary from start to finish in silence. When it was over, she again answered with a brief, "I see." After a moment, she leaned forward to look into Kazuki's face and spoke. And for a moment, I disbelieved my ears.
つまり、彼女たち怪我人は無駄飯ぐらいというわけね。それは。
No, that's the truth. With a start, I realized why Captain Sakashira had driven Koide from the tent. Whatever the circumstances, she was our leader, and in speaking those words, she had just betrayed that responsibility. Maybe we'd all thought the same, in some dark corner of our mind, but no one had voiced that ugly thought, and now the captain had coolly thrown it out into the open. She understood as well as we did that a quite crippling pessimism regarding the food situation had begun to spread among the group. If we were to continue on these meager rations, the currently able-bodied girls would eventually be reduced to invalids. Without adequate nourishment, our physical strength would be drained, sapping us of the energy to work, and with our bodies weakened, disease would spread all too easily around the camp. Simply by existing, the wounded were acting as a heavy drain on our precious supply of food. Their presence was reducing everyone else's ration. Ultimately, this might soon give rise to more sick people, exponentially worsening the problem. When we weigh the lives of the wounded and the healthy against each other, the former will always be lighter on the scales. In this harsh environment, that pragmatic calculation felt all the more obvious. We don't have the elbow room to be handing out rations to those who can't work. The captain's argument was coherent enough, and I understood that she had little choice but to approach our situation with conservative caution. But nonetheless, her words sounded like a betrayal, a justification for unburdening ourselves of a load that had grown troublesome to carry, an excuse to abandon our friends and save ourselves.
私にずる賢く生きろと言ったのは風見さん、あなたよ。
ええ、確かに。でも、ずる賢く生きるのと弱者を吊るし上げて憂を晴らすのとでは意味が全然違います。
I don't know. I feel like she's actually being very, what is it, rational. What are you talking about? That's not escapism. Are you crazy?
だったらあなたはその弱者の口を賄い切るだけの食料を持ち合わせているの？
Yeah, I feel like what she's saying is coherent enough, and actually, it makes a lot of sense.
いいえ、残念ながら。
口だけの綺麗事ならいくらでも言えます。あなたのいい人ごっこに付き合わされて日々体力を落とす部員たちの迷惑を少しは考えてみては？
Those spiteful words were all too clearly a deliberate act of revenge for Kazuki's insults this afternoon. Whether she was at a loss for words or simply too exasperated to speak wasn't clear, but Kazuki offered no reply other than a short, tight little sigh. I long before decided to keep my silence and leave this conversation entirely to Kazuki, but all of a sudden I found myself unable to suppress the need to object.
それはあんまりですよ。怪我人は餓死するまで見殺しなんですか？
そうは言っていないでしょ。
For the first time in the conversation, the captain turned to me. She'd grown gaunt in recent days, leaving her cheekbones just so prominent that her eyes seemed to have sunken in her face. It made her grim gaze seem all the more severe. Like I said on the previous episode, I really did wish, or do wish, that they had a more skeleton-looking sprite for these girls as the day goes on. Would have been a lot more intense, right? Rather than keeping the girls all nice-looking and cute-looking. But like I said, priorities. It's gonna cost more to actually give them more sprites. And also, people that are playing the game wouldn't actually want to waifu them up.
配給の優先度を下げるといっただけで一切の食事を与えないわけではないわ。もちろん今後も適度な量を配給します。どうせ動けないのだからお腹もあまり減らないのでしょ。
それは違います。
There was another reason Hiroka-san had refused to eat that afternoon. And with the construction of the toilet, that problem had been eliminated. We could simply help her to the toilet seat and let her relieve herself in privacy, removing the biggest psychological roadblock to her recovery.
いいのよ、あまね。部長の言い分も決して間違いではないのよ。でも、広岡さんには私の分の配給を分配します。それなら文句はないでしょ。
なぜ私に確認するのかしら。あなたの食料なのだからあなたが勝手にすればいいわ。
ではそうします。
Kazuki leaned forward in a very slight bow as she stood. Lightly speaking the words, "Let's return," in my general direction, she abruptly left the tent.
待ってよ、和樹。はい、なに？なにじゃないよ。どうして何も言い返さないの？言うだけ無駄だと思ったからよ。そんなの、私は和樹のことだから絶対に食ってかかると思っていたし、いつもみたいに文句の一つも言って強引に丸め込めばよかったのに。
Amane, are you... I know that Amane keeps saying that she's dumb or something, right? But I really do believe that she's not the smartest tool in the shed, or the sharpest tool in the shed, as the saying goes. There was no counter-argument for that. She was being very logical about what she's saying.
あなた何を言っているの？文句というのは相手の言動や態度が間違っていたり正しかったとしても気に入らない時につけるものよ。
Agreed?
それ以外の時に口にする言葉のことは難癖というの。覚えておきなさい。なんだ よそれ。全然納得できないよ、和樹。
Damn, yeah, she is dumb.
言ったでしょ。部長の言っていることも間違いではないのよ。
だからって怪我人の食事を減らすなんて間違ってるよ。
So, you want to give your share of the food to them?
だから私の食事を分けてあげるんじゃない。ノープロブレム。
Yeah, Kazuki's actually giving her share of the food. That's kind of insane if you think about it. But, remember on the last episode, I think she does have whoever the senpai that dies supply of candies, so she might be eating those in reserve.
全然ノープロブレムじゃないよ。忘れてるかもしれないけど、和樹だって怪我人なんだよ。
分かってるって。
何をどう分かってるっていうのさ。やっぱり今からでも部長に言って考え直してもらおうよ。こんなの間違ってるって和樹が文句を言えば絶対なんとかなるし、言うだけ言ってみようよ。
はあ。
いやあね、あなたの口ぶりではまるで私が何にでも噛みつくどこかのヒステリー女みたいじゃない。私だって世の中すべての間違いに文句をつけるわけではないのよ。
そうかな。
Personally, I kind of had this image of Kazuki waving a battle flag emblazoned with the words, "We must correct the world," on some vague battlefield. Then charging forth at the head of the vanguard, all John Dark style. I don't know if I'm saying John's name correctly. I think I am. Leading a glorious crusade across the mistake-riddled modern age.
私ほど間違いに寛大な女はいないわよ。考えてもごらんなさいな。私が坂下部長に、あなたなぜ生まれてきたのと質問しているところを見たことがある？
Okay, that's going too far though. Asking someone why you were even born, like... that's just... No one wanted themselves to be born, Kazuki. The fact that no one has the right to say that. Not even their parents, to be completely honest.
ないけど。ちょっと待って。今なんかさらっとものすごいこと言わなかった？
She did. That kind of sounded like an indirect way of implying that girl should never have been born to me.
慈悲深くも寛大な私の資料を理解できたのなら、さっさとテントに戻りましょう。そろそろ眠くなってきたわ。
That was actually a very unfunny joke. I dislike that.
和樹ってさ、そういうとこマイペースだよね。
It was already past 9 p.m. I looked up through the trees to the sky, empty except for the bright moon and twinkling stars. The helicopter we'd seen for a few brief moments on the second day had been absent ever since. I strained my ears but heard only the chirping of bugs. No cars running on the road above. Nothing. Why hasn't anybody noticed? There's a group of girls right down here, suffering so much. I was seized by the meaningless desire to scream for help at the moon, but I knew I'd only be making my throat hoarse. That early summer night, only the lonesome voices of insects echoed through the Haraki Valley. The 8th day in the valley. Rain fell in the night, and the morning was cold. My chilled hand trembled slightly as I wrote. Come to think of it, was there even a point to keeping this diary in the first place? Thinking about it would always drain me of the will to write, but I never found an excuse to quit either. My pen moved mechanically across the pages. Fortunately, the rain had stopped before today's morning muster. Perhaps I'd become used to being drummed out of bed at the same time every morning, as recently, I was waking up naturally 15 minutes before 6. For the first few days, it had been difficult to sleep at night because of my hunger. But by now, I was sleeping like a stone, and fasting at night actually seemed to make waking up in the mornings easier. It's because our bodies are smart. If we don't ingest like a lot of calories, we're actually going to be exerting less calories as the days go by. It's a self-preservation instinct. Of course, naturally, if we still do not have enough calories, at some point we're gonna die out of starvation. But our bodies can actually live for quite a few days without food. Especially if you are fat. That said, getting out of bed once awake was growing increasingly difficult. I had no choice but to spend 15 minutes in bed, waiting for my blood pressure to rise until I could stand up without instantly becoming lightheaded. This morning, Professor Kazami's tour of inspection proceeded as usual. The valley was shrouded in a cold, damp mist. As we made our way across the examination line, many of the girls were swaying unsteadily on their feet, their bodies still not fully awake.
おはよう、いぶきさん。今朝の体調はどうかしら？
まあ、ぼちぼちです。
疲れた顔をしているわね。私たちがここへ来て今日で何日目だったかしら？
え？ああ、8日目？
そう、8日目。今朝は寒いわね。昨日と比べてどっちが寒い？
昨日はそんなに寒くなかったと思うけど、むしろ暑かったぐらいで。
ええ、そうね。お母様はお元気？今年でおいくつになられたのかしら？
何急に？
いいから教えてくださらない？
母は、多分元気。今年で42歳。
この子の名前は？
Kazuki grabbed my arm and pulled me over.
あまね。
名字を教えてくれる？スオーよ。だいぶ疲れが溜まっているみたいね。無理もないわ。私たちがここへ来て今日で何日目だったかしら？考えるのが面倒になった？でも考えて。今日は何日目？4
日目。
あらびっくり。ウェルニッケ脳症かしら？チアミン不足ね。
Smiling brightly, Kazuki leaned over and softly whispered into my ear.
今から言うことをメモして。
I hastily brought my pen to my memo pad. To the memo pad. Chronic Wernicke's encephalopathy. Symptoms of Korsakoff's dementia. Serious thiamine vitamin B1 deficiency. We knew it was a vitamin deficiency. We knew it had grown serious. But that diagnosis was... Diagnosis? Diagnosis? I feel like that's not what I should be pronouncing that as. Diagnosis? There we go. Diagnosis wasn't much good to us. We didn't have any needles, and more importantly, we didn't have any dietary supplements to fill them with. Of course, a dietetic regimen with lots of pork, liver, and milk could have done the job just as well. But we didn't have enough food to satisfy even our basic caloric requirements. The only thing we could do for Ibuki was give her an encouraging thump on the shoulder
耐えろ。
and express the hope her youthful resilience would pull her through. Are you kidding? You're at the school of like Ojo-samas, right? You guys are rich folks. There's no way you guys will be able to tough this out. You guys aren't, you know, people from the army. None of this was limited to Ibuki Haruna either. The majority of the group was beginning to suffer from vitamin deficiencies. Light fever, joint pains, and shortness of breath were widespread. Like, not even people from the army, if they're like starving, would be able to keep a hold of themselves. That's for sure. After our standard round of inspections came to an end, everyone dragged themselves right back to their tents. The morning was unpleasantly cold, and the pervasive sense of physical exhaustion didn't help either. Nobody wanted to wander off into the humid forest, humid, where the chilly fog hung thick as a cloud. By the time noon rolled around, the temperature had risen dramatically. Risen? I think it's risen. And people began to crawl out of their stuffy tents in search of cool air. For another thing, We needed to dry our sleeping bags and mats in the sun, as they had grown damp from the humid night air and our sweat. Like the others, I pulled the bedding out of our tent, spreading them out on a long, flat rock nearby. Naturally, I took Kazuki's as well. I began to beat the sleeping bags with a tree branch, dust and dead mites flying out in little clouds with every impact. My stomach growled miserably at the exercise. Just as Kazuki declared yesterday, she had begun to add much of her rations to Hiruka's meals. Of course, this was being kept secret from Hiruka-san herself. At this rate, Kazuki wouldn't last long. When I told her I was worried, she laughed off my worries with some cliché about starving samurai making particularly leisurely use of their toothpick. Then added that a leader doesn't need to eat, they just need to act like they're eating. The words had given me a bit of a start. It was certainly true that everyone was relying on Kazuki, but I was surprised she'd come to think of herself as a leader. All of a sudden, I heard someone shouting in a clearly angry tone of voice, and my hand stopped in mid-swing. Sound carries well through humid air. The bellowing voice of our team's advisor, Mr. Ochi, reverberated impressively around the rocky valley.
盗んだのは誰だ?俺の荷物から食料を盗んだ者は正直に名乗り出ろ!
I didn't understand the exact details, but apparently someone had stolen food from Mr. Ochi's personal belongings. In the distance, I saw him lifting his rucksack high in the air, his face flushed red with anger. Glancing around the area, I found the others who had left their tents fixedly studying the ground, carefully avoiding eye contact with our teacher. Kaneda-senpai, still focused on scraping out the burned grains of rice stuck in the corners of our cooker, softly mumbled, "What a joke," without even raising her head.
誰なんだ?今正直に名乗り出れば処分を考えないでもないぞ。
先生の勘違いじゃないんですか?
そんなことはない!
一体何がなくなったというんですか?
それは。
Oh, okay, I thought he was gonna say something more. Mr. Ochi stumbled awkwardly over his words. From the look of things, the missing food had probably been something he'd hidden away instead of contributing to the common stock.
とにかくこの中の誰かが盗んだのは間違いないんだ。
Even now, he shouts bored, the righteous, authoritative tone of a scolding teacher. But we weren't in the classroom. The students responded only with irritated scowls. Of course, I also furrowed my brow at Mr. Ochi's actions. No matter how much he bellowed, it was perfectly obvious the culprit wasn't going to come forward. And in doing so, he was planting the idea of stealing from others in the minds of all the girls who'd been honestly enduring their hunger until now. So if I get hungry, I can just steal food from someone, right? As long as I keep my mouth shut, nobody's going to find out. And it looks like everybody else is doing it anyway. The only thing Mr. Ochi was accomplishing with this tirade was sowing these dangerous thoughts in the back of our minds. When a single carrot went missing from Koide-senpai's tent earlier, Kazuki had skillfully concealed the incident in order to avoid this exact situation. Now it was all for naught. Without a doubt, this problem would reoccur in the future. In order for people to live as human beings, 3 basic rules need to be respected. 1. Don't steal. 2. Don't destroy. 3. Don't kill. Well, I don't know about that. Lots of people do all 3 of them. 3 broad principles that define the minimum standard of ethical behavior. Talking about ethics in a place where there's no actual laws to stop you from doing anything. And in our little community, one of those 3 had just been irrevocably broken. They say that liars often end up as thieves, but the opposite is just as true. When we become thieves, we begin to lie. Deceiving and deceived in turn, we snatch the food from each other's mouths. Before long, accusations fly. Thefts become brazen, retaliatory. Fistfights break out. In the end, some turn to outright violence, attacking others, destroying their property, taking what they want by force. All trust is lost. If things were to reach that stage, it would all be over. None of us would survive. we would destroy ourselves over scraps of food. Kazuki had anticipated this outcome from the very beginning. That afternoon, I was in the forest with Kazuki, gathering edible plants, brooding on the morning's events. I'd long since lost track of how many times I'd asked her the question on my tongue, but I couldn't help myself. You know, I do think to some degree, everything that's going on is Kazuki's fault. Right? I personally believe if people actually went to the forest and died without this being an... Well, I don't know. Maybe she had optimism that they were gonna get rescued at some point rather than throwing caution to the wind by going to the forest, but I personally would have gone to the forest myself. I'd rather take chance than just waiting. But that's just me personally, though.
ねえ、カズキ。私たちこれからどうなるのかな?
And also, considering Kazuki was the one who snatched the bag with sweets, maybe she was also the one that snatched Mr. Ochi's belongings, whatever it is.
14回目。
But I don't remember.
あなたがその質問を私にした回数。
いちいち数えてるの?
Is that throughout the day or throughout, all the 8 days that we've been here?
この質問何回目だっけと聞かれたら答えてあげようと思って。
And Kazuki's reply too was the same repetitive phrase as always. What will be will be. There's no way to know how this will end. She certainly seemed fond of it, but to be honest, I'd always thought it was a bit of a non-answer. Certainly didn't make me feel much better.
越智先生は明日ここを出ていくそうよ。
出ていくってどうして?
数日かけて周辺を調べて、なんとか下山できそうな目処が立ったそうよ。
Apparently, having finally decided that just yesterday to leave and get help, Mr. Ochi had been preparing for his departure this morning. During this process, he noticed the hidden food had gone missing from his rucksack.
先生が隠し持っていたのは、合宿の夜にこっそりと楽しんでいた晩酌で、ビールのつまみにと用意していたミニサラミだったらしいわね。
サラミか。
See, the fact that Kazuki knows what it is means that she probably is the one who stole it. An Italian sausage, ground pork, seasoned with spices and cured, I don't know how to say that actually. I think it's cured, I guess, by drying. Preserved food like that would make for ideal rations, as it doesn't go bad easily. You could slice it up thinly and drop it on pizza, or maybe mince it and mix it into a big plate of pasta. Just imagining the spicy, salty taste left my mouth overflowing with drool.
誰が取ったのかな?
それは重要な問題じゃないわ。越智先生としては誰も名乗り出なかったのがショックだったみたいね。もう限界だって泣きそうな顔をしていたわ。
そっか。
From the beginning, Mr. Ochi had said he wasn't really cut out for this job. As for why, apparently he simply had a hard time dealing with women in general. Given that his job involved corralling girls at the most emotional stage of adolescence, he found the experience immensely nerve-wracking at the best of times. And now, of all things, he was living under terrible conditions with a pack of desperate girls, increasingly crushed under the pressure of their excessive expectations. Really, it was hardly surprising he'd want to make a break for it as soon as humanly possible.
先生がいなくなったら、私たちどうなるんだろう?
Nothing will change, really.
こういう言い方は先生に対して甚だ失礼だとは思うけれど、体制に影響はないと思うわよ。
To be sure, Mr. Ochi was never exactly a powerful presence. Even during our normal team activities, I'd always thought of him as more of a cushion between the official authority of the school and the day-to-day management, which was almost entirely handled by our team captain. Still, we had more faith in him than that might suggest. He was an adult with a legal responsibility to us, and as a man, he was better physically equipped to handle certain jobs. His presence here had been subtly reassuring in its way, allowing us to slip back into the comfortingly passive role of students. And while he wasn't much for stopping our fights, the fact that a teacher was watching acted as a significant check on our behavior. If Mr. Ochi were to leave the camp tomorrow, we lose our only real authority figure. Wasn't there a chance his departure could become the spark that would set off a descent into something uglier?
不安だよ、和樹。
大丈夫よ。もしもの時は私があなたを守ってあげるから。ね。
You'd think she was an elder sister calming a frightened younger sibling. Her words were immensely reassuring, but also inspired something very close to shame. It felt as though I'd just forced another responsibility onto Kazuki's overburdened shoulders out of nothing more than pathetic weakness. My face crumbled bitterly, and I could feel tears building behind my eyes. If you feel that way, don't voice your concerns, damn you! God, I guess some people can't help themselves though. Sorry, I think I'm being a bit way too harsh to Amane because I really dislike her.
もしもの時って？
もしもの時はもしもの時。多くは想定外の好ましくない事態に遭遇した状況を指してそう呼びます。
これ以上まだ状況が悪くなるってこと？
まあなるでしょうね。でも心配はいらないわ。もしも何かを犠牲にしなければあなたを守れないという状況になったら、私は全てを犠牲にしてでもあなたを守るから全然大丈夫。愛してるわ、アマネ。
嬉しいけど大丈夫だよ。私自分の身は自分で守るから。
So weird.
あら本当？実は私も自分のことで精一杯な部分もあって、そうしてもらえるとすごく助かるわ。
I guess Kazuki is rather fond of Amane. I don't know, maybe I'm just a very non-kind person. I feel like a lot of people here, especially in this situation, I mean, would be more dead weight than not. I personally would be better off alone. But then again, maybe that's my edgy nature rearing its head. Edgy Azai. Kazuki was just affirming my own words, but for some reason, it felt like she was abandoning me. All of a sudden, there was a dull pain in my chest.
大丈夫よ。アマネは強い子だから。ね。
That's right. I can't let myself stay dependent on Kazuki forever. I wanted her words to be true. I wanted to be strong. Strong enough to help her. Strong enough to protect her. Strong enough to be necessary to her. If I couldn't be strong now, I had the feeling I'd be weak forever. Always hiding behind the protection of others. Helpless and worthless until the end of my days. The 9th day in the valley. The morning of Mr. Ochi's departure from the camp was, unfortunately, a rainy one.
先生、どうかお気をつけて。
With the exception of the immobile Hiroka-san, everyone gathered in the drizzling rain to see our teacher off. Mr. Ochi stood before us, a heavy rucksack on his back, impassive to the water running down his glasses. It felt as though I was looking at a young officer about to head off on for the front lines. As a matter of fact, there had been some vaguely sarcastic jokes yesterday about making him one of those 1,000-stitch belt good luck charms the Imperial soldiers used to take to war. But no matter how unreliable Mr. Ochi had been as a teacher, everyone quietly recognized that he was now our only visible glimmer of hope. 10 members of the basketball team had survived the fall. Our belt would have come up a good 990 stitches short. Not to say that we sent him off completely empty-handed. Although our gift was less sentimental and more practical, when the rain began to fall this morning, we hastily cut apart trash bags to create a makeshift poncho. These had been a virtual necessity on rainy days, especially before we constructed the toilet, so we had the hang of making them by this point. The poncho offered some protection from the rain while allowing free use of both arms. For a short time, at least, it would keep out the wet and prevent your body temperature from falling too dramatically. That said, in the end, it was a pretty flimsy thing. On a cosmetic level, it was not only distinctly ugly, it made an irritating rustling sound every time you took a step. Nonetheless, Mr. Ochi accepted it with a sincerely grateful thank you.
では行くよ。必ず助けを呼んでくる。それまで、なんとか生き延びてくれ。
With those brief words, Mr. Ochi turned his back on us and immediately began to walk off. Lingering for a long farewell would have been a waste of daylight hours. Once inside the forest, the thick tree canopy would block out most of the sun's light. We knew all too well how poor his visibility would be in this rain, which would soon transform the jungle into a misty, unfamiliar labyrinth. Of course, some suggested postponing any action until the weather improved. But if we delayed over the rain, it felt entirely possible we'd keep finding excuses to put off that first step. To me, that first step should have been done at day 1. But I guess yeah, they were a bit too optimistic, or like I said, I think Kazuki made a miscalculation here. Or maybe this is what she wanted, you never know. Maybe tomorrow it would be too hot, or somebody would feel too sick. Before long, sheer inertia would glue us to our comfortable sleeping bags. Because he understood that Mr. Ochi had made the firm decision to leave today, regardless of conditions. We watched him marching bravely down toward the forest, unable to keep the knees from our faces. If we'd had little rising sun flags to flap around, we wouldn't have looked out of place in a 60-year-old photograph. But unlike the relatives of those doomed soldiers, our anxiety was accompanied by an undercurrent of guilt. We weren't afraid of our teacher's well-being. We were worried about our own uncertain future.
先生、大丈夫かな?
The words spilled spontaneously out of my mouth. Sakuma-senpai, who'd been standing at my side throughout the little ceremony, glanced over.
まあ正直、あまり期待しない方がいいね。
Sakuma's tone of voice was resigned, almost detached. The first to respond was Ibuki, who'd been standing at her partner's side, her limbs shivering in the cold rain.
私たちの食料、半分も持って行ったんですよ。結果を出してくれなきゃ困りますよ。
Kaneda-senpai, as always, scratching vigorously away at the bandage on her forehead, gave a little snort of laughter at Ibuki's words.
あれでも一応大学時代はテニス部だったんでしょ？体力はあるんじゃないの？
Next in line stood Komori-san, her miniature dog's face peeping out from the neck of her school uniform.
どうしてテニス部だった人がバスケ部の顧問やってるんでしょう?
At Komori's other side, Sakurai was pressing her hands against her stomach wound, bending over slightly to shield it from the rain. As the conversation seemed to be moving neatly down the line, she tentatively opened her mouth and spoke.
大学のテニス部って、要は女の子目当てのナンパな男子が集まる部でしょ？冬はスキー部になったりする感じの。
That's a bit harsh, don't you think? I would think that people who join a ski club in winter just wanted to go skiing, because that's the only time you can go skiing, right? Apparently amused to hear these words from the normally meek and refined Sakurai-senpai, Kazuki chuckled lightly at her side.
その認識で間違ってないところが悲しいわね。
Her eyes fixed on Mr. Ochi as his figure grew small in the distance. Koide-senpai responded to Kazuki's words with an anxious frown.
本当、大丈夫なのかな?
Now that he had set forth, there was nothing more we could do either way. It was in the hands of fate now. Sakuma-senpai gave a wry little snort. Lately, her prowess at playing cards had allowed her to push most of her chores onto others, and her attitude was getting increasingly irreverent as her leisure time grew.
あとはもう運布添付に任せるしかないね。分の悪い賭けだけど、賭けってのはその方が面白いよ。
Clearly irritated by Sakuma's flippant tone, Captain Sakashida finally broke her silent vigil.
遊びじゃないのよ。くだらない冗談を言っている暇があるなら、他にやるべきことがいくらでもあるでしょ。
There is? Question mark.
はいはい、ごめんよ。
Sakuma's typically indifferent response earned her a brief, withering glare. After a moment, the captain turned sharply on her heel and stalked off toward her tent without another word. Heaving a small sigh at this abrupt departure, Koide gave a light nod of acknowledgement to Kazuki, then trotted off to follow her partner.
なんかさ、坂下を見てると、こういう状況でも怒鳴り散らすだけの人間がどれだけ惨めかって思い知らされるよね。彼女を見ていると、しっかりしなきゃって逆に落ち着いてくるよ。そういう意味では、いい反面教師だ。
You're talking like you're any better though, to be honest, Sakuma. Obeying someone simply because they outshout any voices of opposition in the height of foolishness. Over the days we'd spent here, that realization had sunk deeply into our very bones. At moments like these, everyone's gaze would naturally settle on Kazuki. They turned to a freshman, a small girl no taller than 150 centimeters, with eyes of absolute trust. The third years among us were no exception. The vaguely rebellious Sakuma seemed to have concluded in characteristically happy-go-lucky style that, when Kazami is around, life's a lot easier. And having essentially entrusted her life to Kazuki as a patient, Sakurai-senpai had even begun to politely address her with an honorific.
言い方はどうあれ、坂下部長の言葉に間違いがないのも事実です。寒暖じみた愚痴り合いをしている暇があれば、食べ物を探しましょう。
There was no changing the fact that we'd given half of our already meager stockpile to Mr. Ochi. From today on, our meals would be all the more grimly austere. I actually don't know what that word is. Even so, he'd only taken enough food for 2 days, along with 2 liters of sterilized water in plastic bottles. From a simple estimate of the calories he'd be consuming and burning, it'd last 4 days at the longest. Although Mr. Ochi had estimated that 3 days of consistent progress would bring him to human habitation, we all knew perfectly well that he wouldn't be able to simply stroll straight through that forest. If we were doing this at the start, we probably could have. Now that we starved ourselves and don't have the necessary food and water, yeah, of course not. But he himself was probably more familiar with that harsh reality than any of us, so we kept our silence.
ああ、この雨の中、森に入るのか。何言ってんですか。どうせ森に入ってもフラフラしてるだけで、全然働かないくせに。仕方がないよ。私は貴族だからね。一つお願いがあるんですけど、いいですか。なんだい？言ってごらんよ。一度本気で殴らせてください。いいえ、みんなのために単身森に入った越智先生に代わって先輩を殴ります。それで君の気が晴れるのならそうするといい。あまり痛くしないでもらえると助かるかな。だから髪に触らないでください。
Harshly slapping aside Sakuma-senpai's hand, Ibuki stamped off toward the forest alone. Watching her partner go, Sakuma spread her arms, turned her palms to the sky, and offered an exaggerated shrug of the shoulders to no one in particular. But soon enough, she followed without a word. All said and done, they were a friendly pair.
私らはどうする？
Fiddling with her rain-wet bandage as she brushed her hair out of her eyes, Kaneda-senpai turned to address her partner, Komori. Staring down at the dog nestled against her chest, Komori-senpai answered in an apologetic tone of voice.
すみません。今日はアー君の具合が悪いみたいで。またかよ。なんかその犬、雨が降るとすぐ体調崩すよね。やっぱあれか？湿度が高いと前髪が決まんなくて超下げなんですけどみたいな感じになんのかね。まさかそれはないと思いますけど。まあいいよ。今日は私が行くからさ。あんたは犬と一緒にテントで待ってな。すみません。
Kaneda set off with broad strides, apparently trying to play up her self-assigned role as the manly big brother of the household. Komori hurried off as well, leaning over the dog in her uniform to shield it from the elements. They could have just locked the dog inside of the tent, you know? Weird. Well then, what about us? When I glanced over in Kazuki's direction, I was surprised to find Sakurai-senpai still loitering quietly by her side. When our eyes met, Sakurai gave me a gentle smile, and cocked her head slightly to one side as if to say, "Is something the matter?" Staring into her face, I couldn't help thinking she really was a good bit more beautiful than the average pinup you'd find in a cheap men's magazine.
桜井先輩はどうされます？
今までの恩返しもありますし、できれば食材探しに私も参加させてもらえればと。
それは助かりますけど、大丈夫なんですか？はい、
お腹の怪我ももうだいぶ良くなってきましたし。ダメよ。でも気持ちはわかるしありがたいけれど、今無理をすればまた悪化するわよ。桜井さんはテントに戻って広岡さんについていてあげてください。つまんない。食材探しだって別に楽しくはないわ。もともとあなたは体が丈夫ではないのだし、おとなしく私の言うことを聞きなさい。はーい。
今の何？
くしゃみよ。
でも今ペキュって言ったよ。
一見すると欠点が少ないように見える桜井さんだけれど、どうにもくしゃみが変なのよね、この人。気にしてるのに。いいからさっさとテントに戻りなさい。この上風邪をひいたりしたらまた私の仕事が増えるじゃないの。はいはい。
Smiling sweetly, Sakurai patted Kazuki on the head, then obediently walked off toward her tent. That is, the large tent where Hiroka-san was waiting.
桜井先輩、美人だね。
そうね。性格もおとなしいし、本当に欠点の少ない人だわ。もうお腹が出るような水着は着れないと思うけれど。
そっか。
As she watched Sakurai-senpai walk away, her thin arms shielding her stomach, Kazuki's profile betrayed a hint of sadness. Sakurai's parents have probably been planning to bring their daughter into the world of show business sooner or later. What would they think when they saw that wound across her belly? An ugly, jagged, dark red gash, discharging pus faster than we could clean and disinfect it. Would they be overjoyed their daughter had at least survived, or hurt by her misfortune?
私たちも行きましょう。
そうだね。
When I stared down at the misty jungle, I could see the indistinct shapes of human beings wriggling into the trees in search of sustenance. We were stumbling in fog, nothing to guide us, nothing but the unknown ahead, clawing desperately for survival. How long would this go on? How long until fortune smiled on us? How long until we could rest? What will be will be. There's no way to know how this will end. For now, we just need to do what we can. For now, those words were still enough to keep my feet moving, but I was beginning to feel that the limits of my endurance might be approaching. Even so, as Kazami Kazuki made her way down the valley, the only thought in my mind was to follow her. By now, I'd stopped even considering any other course of action. Man, the rain is not stopping. I actually really dislike the rain, especially when I'm outside, so it's pretty damn depressing. When I'm inside, if it's raining, I don't really care. But when I'm outside, like when I want to go to the gym, I actually cycle to the gym, so it'll be pretty damn annoying. The 10th day in the valley.
また雨だ。もううんざり。雨が降ると途端に体がだるくなる。頭が重い。テントの中にいても雨はどんどん染み込んでくるし、慢性化した湿気が原因なのか 苔だかカビだかの青臭いような匂いがますます濃くなってくる。ここ数日の雨の様子はほとんど梅雨の様相だ。今度の雨は相当にしつこい。当分やみそうもない。テントを叩く雨粒の音でなんとなくそうわかる。梢の隙間を伝って育った大きな雨粒がテントに当たる音は不規則で、ずっと聞いているとイライラしてくる。満たされない空腹もまたイライラの原因だ。
Is she done? I thought she was gonna say something more.
もはや口癖のように、ああお腹が空いたと私が口にすれば、最近の和樹は眉を寄せる。そんなこと言われなくても分かっているわと機嫌が悪くなるのだ。それでも私が空腹を訴え続ければ、最後にはうるせえ、寝ちまえとそんなことを言い出す。
You know, it is also kind of weird to be honest, considering that this is summer, right? But they have a lot of rain. I feel like there's a lot of inconsistencies that's happening currently, you know?
ちょっと、私はそんなことを言った覚えはないわよ。私は動く必要のない時には眠るのも立派な仕事よと言っただけでしょ。
やだな和樹、勝手に私の日記を読まないでよ。
読んでないわよ。あなたが日記を書きながらそれを声に出して勝手に私に聞かせていたんでしょ。
嘘。
自覚なし。重症ね。気をつけなさい、あまね。まるで一人でブツブツと文句を言いながら料理をするとんかつ屋の主人みたいで気持ち悪いわよ。
I don't think there's anything wrong with mumbling to yourself.
何それ、よくわかんないけど、人の顔を真剣に見つめてキモいとか言わんといてもらえる？へこむわ。
ほら、私が捕まえたカタツムリをあげるから、これでも食べて元気を出しなさい。
もうでんでん虫飽きた。っていうか虫以外のものが食べたいよ。
The fact that you can still say that about the food that you're eating means that, you know, being able to still be picky about the food you're eating means that you're not hungry enough, Amane.
カタツムリは陸外よ。まあ貝は虫じゃないのかと言われると微妙なのだけれど、それよりあまね。
Kazuki pointed to her cheek with one finger as if to tell me I had a grain of rice stuck to the corner of my mouth. After a brief moment of confusion, I brought my hand up to my face. My fingers quickly found something slimy on my cheek. That is to say, a leech. I'd grown exceptionally tough-minded about this sort of thing. Another leech wasn't going to get a scream out of me this late in the game. Carefully peeling the creature off my cheek, I held it between the fingertips of both hands, dug my nails into its body, and ripped it apart. This was another lovely side effect of the rain. Leeches had begun to find their way inside our tent. After waking up, peeling the bloodsuckers off my body was becoming the first part of my daily routine. First and foremost, I had to peel them off my eyelids. That is actually pretty disturbing. Next, the ones sticking to my neck, wrist, and ankles. The leeches seem to have a particular fondness for these points where the body grows narrow. Other than that, they'd also go for places where the skin was thin. The back of my knees and elbows, my armpits, my groin. There were even a few that burrowed in between my toes, as if trying to make themselves a cozy little nest. The first few times this happened, we'd shriek hysterically when we woke. But after a few days, we lost the will to even moan. And either our bodies had developed a resistance to Hirurin, or we just gotten used to treating the bites, as the trickle of blood from the wounds would now stop after only an hour or so. Kazuki speculated our growing sodium deficiency might be affecting the salinity of our blood, but there was no way to tell for sure. As the day crept into evening without a break in the rain, Kazuki and I headed to the large tent in order to visit Hiroka-san and Sakurai-senpai. Outside, I started the usual fire under the primitive stove, made the usual thin, watery wheat soup, and boiled the usual bucket of hot water. With the gruel in my right hand and the hot water in my left, I made my way to the hospital tent. It was important to remember which was in which hand, since it was no longer obvious which was the water and which was the gruel. Calling it gruel was a bit of a joke by this point. At a glance, it looked more like stone soup. Even so, since we were mixing in a bit of the rice distributed to Kazuki and me, the wounded Sakura and Hiroka were still eating slightly better than the rest of us.
お湯が沸いたよ。
ありがとうアマネ。そこの手ぬぐいを熱湯で消毒して広岡さんの体を拭いてあげてくれる？
うん、任せて。
Kazuki didn't turn around when I entered the tent. She was steadily unwinding the yellow-stained bandages from Sakurai's stomach and removing the gauze from her wound to be replaced. We'd washed the gauze over and over in boiling water to the point it was beginning to blacken. It made for all the more striking a contrast against the yellow pus that permeated its surface. No matter how many times we carefully disinfected Sakurai's laceration, the suppuration wasn't showing any signs of stopping. Suppuration? That is the first time I saw that word. If we weren't in this situation, it surely wouldn't have been difficult to treat. But given our unsanitary conditions and utter lack of medical supplies, we simply couldn't stop the bacteria from multiplying. Above all else, the patient wasn't getting the nutrition her body needed to fight its way to recovery. When I reached out for the dirty gauze in order to sterilize it for reuse, I noticed something squirming on its surface. It was a maggot. Thrashing its fat little body madly from within the depths of the pus that had soaked into the gauze, it almost seemed to be consciously trying to crawl back towards Sakurai's stomach.
こっちはいいから広岡さんを。
Immersing the washcloth, a strip of cloth cut from an old t-shirt, in the hot water, I left it to soak and began to unbutton Hiroka-san's uniform. At first, she'd been quite embarrassed to be seen naked, but by now she submitted quietly without even squirming. She might simply have lost the energy necessary to feel shame. Hiroka-san's chest had withered dramatically since the first time I'd wiped her clean. Her ribs stood out distinctly against the surface of her skin. And that skin was mottled here and there with small white flecks. The small fuzzy little spots could be dusted off by hand. At first, I thought them to be something like cotton dust from her sleeping bag. But when I asked Kazuki, I learned for the first time that mold can grow on living human body. Of course it can! If it's human enough, I guess. Hiroka-san was covered in pale white mildew.
ちょっと待ってね。今熱いタオルで拭いてあげるから。
私もう痛い。
Stop, don't to die? Oh wow, stop, I want to die. I think that's what she's saying.
なんて？
Hiroka's dry, cracked lips were moving slightly. I lowered my ear to her mouth.
私もう死にたい。
大丈夫だよ。ちょっとカビが生えただけじゃん。
Scooping the washcloth out of the hot water with a pair of chopsticks, I waited for it to cool below scalding, then gave it a vigorous squeeze.
体中がかゆいの。気が変になりそう。もう嫌。
Yeah, I think she's probably having the worst out of all of us here, right? Even though she is eating better than everyone else, she can't move. She's soiled herself. And yeah, she's not really getting any better.
我慢して。今きれいにしてあげるから。
I dropped the moderately hot towel against Hiroka-san's body and began to wipe. The mold came off cleanly, but underneath, there were innumerable angry, swollen red welts where fingernails had dug into her flesh.
書いちゃダメって言ったのに。
The more she scratched, the more she spread the mold across her body.
ごめんなさい。どうしても
Yeah, she probably had a skin infection because of the mold that's growing inside or on her body. There's actually lots of what do you call it, like fungus that lives in our body, but you really need to be at a very constant humid place for them to grow exponentially. And I guess because it's been raining for the past, I don't know, couple of days, it's been very bad for her. Wide-scale, unrelenting itchiness is absolute torment. No matter how firmly you're told not to scratch, you'll unconsciously claw at your body while asleep. Hiroka-san's reflexive habit had grown so extreme that we'd actually tried binding her hands to prevent this. That night, she had woken the entire camp screaming. Writhing her body against her restraints, she had scraped her body against the hard ground, crying again and again for help. When I wiped her body clean, the itchiness would reduce at once. She described it as almost a blissful sensation. Even so, that comfort would last an hour or two at most. Once wrapped up in her sleeping bag, the itchiness would return as her body temperature began to rise. I was now making the time-consuming trip to wipe her clean many times a day. Man, so depressing, Hiroka.
大丈夫だよ。そんなこと言っちゃダメだよ。体を拭いてあげるぐらいいつだってしてあげるから元気出してよ。
Not that I can't really, understand her. Being a burden like that, not being able to do anything. Why would you want to live like that, right? If anything, it was bitterly sad to know that there was nothing more I could do for her, no matter how hard I tried.
この恩は必ず返すから。
Well, I don't think you can, Hiroka-san. You're dead in the future.
そうして。そのためには絶対に生き残らないと。ね。
私、死んでも絶対にこの恩を忘れないよ。
Words are cheap, Hiroka-san. The dead can't really do anything, Not for the living, anyway. As she spoke, tears began to run in little streams down Hiroka-san's face. It is nice to hear when people say that, though.
だからそういうこと言わないの。大丈夫。死なないから。
Wiping a tear from Hiroka-san's cheek with the tip of my finger, I reflexively brought it to my mouth. Hiroka-san's tears were still salty. I was slightly envious of that. The 11th day in the valley. It was still raining. It had never stopped raining. There was nothing to do but sit around shivering and waiting for the weather to clear. Yeah, see? Like, there's no way. Like, I could understand if this was spring, but during summertime, raining multiple times in a single day for long periods of time, impossible. Let me tell you, impossible. I've been in Japan for 3 weeks, and you know how many times it rained when I was there? Twice. Doing nothing all day took a surprisingly heavy toll in its own right. After 10 minutes or so of aimless idleness, you'd be seized by an anxious, impatient need to do something. Anything. But it was impossible to step outside even briefly without being drenched in the downpour. The cold rain would drain your energy with terrifying swiftness, and once you got wet, you stayed that way. We knew it was dangerous to stay in so close, but we just didn't have the means to get them dry. You can, like I said, go buck naked. Right now, Mr. Ochi is not even here. The constant seeping rainwater had begun to corrode the thin material that made up the bottom of our tent. Lying down, even with the buffer of the sleeping mat, would leave our whole bodies soaping wet. We had no choice but to sit and wait. In the afternoon, the rain slowed to a heavy drizzle. I had just managed to get a cooking fire going when an eerie sound began to echo across the camp. Someone was singing loudly. It was unmistakably Ibuki's voice.
ついに行かれたか?
Kaneda laughed harshly, an ugly, contorted excuse or a smile on her face.
うるせえぞ! Ibuki!
In an attempt to end the mournful, grimace-inducing dirge, Kaneda-senpai hurled a rock in Ibuki's direction. The stone fell a few feet short, and Ibuki turned in our direction to examine it. Her face was ghastly white, her skin dull. It looked as though she had aged 20 years in the last few days. Picking up the muddy stone, Ibuki pressed it to her nose and sniffed curiously. Apparently deciding it wasn't food, she tossed it casually aside and continued her song. When the world grows warped around you, those who can't bend simply break. But watching Ibuki caterwauling idly up at the rain cloud-filled sky as if to summon the sun. The fuck is caterwauling? So weird. These words, man. Big words. Brain can't compute. I wondered if derangement might sometimes be a blessing rather than a curse. No, it's not, Amane.
なんなんだろうね、あれ。たまにああやっておかしくなるけど、しばらくすると普通に会話できるし、いつものブッキーに戻ってるんだよね。需要不足らしいですよ。いつかは私らもあんな風になるのかね。金田先輩、ここへ来る前、ダイエットとかしてました？あにゃ？じゃあ、大丈夫じゃないですか？
From what Kazuki had told me, Ibuki had been repeatedly subjecting herself to severe, gimmicky diets over the last few months, leaving her with chronic vitamin deficiencies. This is why you don't do shit like that. I mean, when I was in high school, I was also a subject of the whole diet trend and fad. Like, I would reduce the amount I was eating, I wouldn't really exercise to burn off the calories. But that is like one of the worst ways for you to lose the weight. And in fact, you're not even going to be losing a lot of fat in the first place by just reducing the amount of food you're eating. You're gonna be losing a lot of water the first like couple of weeks. And after that, yeah, if you can stick to the diet, you'll probably lose fat, but good luck doing that. Since arriving here, that pre-existing condition had apparently worsened the effects of malnutrition on her body, giving rise to impaired brain function.
参っちゃうよね。うちの子守ももうだいぶやばい感じだよ。
Komori was still shut up in their tent, nursing her dog through a high fever. Apparently, she was feeding every scrap of her rations to the animal.
あいつの家和菓子屋じゃん。親は二人とも仕事で忙しくてめったに構ってもらえなかったみたいでさ。兄弟もいないあいつには犬が兄弟なんだよね。まあ、わかるけどさ。
Even as Kaneda spoke those carefully neutral words, her mouth was twisted with undisguised loathing. Her true feelings were written on her face. She unambiguously hated that feverish, immobile little dog. It was of no use to her, and so she wanted it to disappear. It was as simple as that.
みんなどんどん弱ってく。このまま私らみんな死ぬんだ。
I understood from the tone of her voice that this wasn't more of the usual gallows humor. I understood with such painful clarity that I wished she'd said nothing at all. Glancing up at the sky as the rain began to intensify yet again, I slowly picked myself up off my seat of rock. I can't take this. Couldn't we at least catch a break on this rain? It was adding insult to injury. Knowing full well that it was ridiculous, I did my best whiny preschooler impression and asked Kazuki to make the rain stop.
だから私は神様じゃないのよ。
God, if I was Kazuki, I'd probably left Amane a long time ago.
似たようなもんでしょ。
Everyone called Kazuki a witch. Well, except for the ones who called her a monster. In that case, a little rain magic shouldn't be too much to ask for, right? I mean, I knew it was idiotic, but asking is free. I didn't even click anything. In response to my challenge, Kazuki closed both eyes and exhaled heavily through her nose, as if to say, "Oh, very well then," and lifting both arms toward the sky, she spoke to the heavens. To wit, "O rain, I command you to be-go, on." An exceptionally half-hearted command that dissolved into an open-mouthed yawn at the end. I appreciated that she was considerate enough to play along with my nonsense, but if she was going to bother, couldn't she have at least pretended she was taking it seriously? But well, as it turned out, an hour or so after that, maybe, the rain really did come to a sudden stop. You had to laugh. Kazuki craned her neck back, idly gazing up as the clouds flowed peacefully by.
何でも試してみるものね。
And spoke characteristically impudent words in her characteristically sleepy voice. Characteristically. Staring at her face from the side, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The witch theory was seeming increasingly plausible. Not that, on reflection, I really cared if she was some sort of black magician. It'd be nice to have one on our side right about now. If I asked her to spirit everyone to safety for her next trick, I wonder what would happen. Asking's free after all. I looked over at Kazuki, debating whether to throw this new challenge at her. But before I could decide, she stared up into my eyes and spoke.
全員は無理。そう言ったはずよ。
だから私が質問する前に答えを先に言うのはマナー違反だよ。
あなたは考えていることがすぐに顔に出るから分かりやすいのよね。
It can't be everyone. Her tone of voice was surprisingly breezy, but somehow also exceptionally firm, as if the outcome was set in stone, as if she was merely repeating an established fact. Kazuki's internal calculations must have established something very close to 100% possibility that more of us would die in this place. I repeatedly asked her about the details of her predictions, receiving only variations of the frustrating non-answer. If I told you, the future I predicted would change. When I finally told her that changing this future sounded like a pretty good idea to me, she coolly replied, even if it would mean none of us survive at all? And I found myself at an utter loss for words. Well, maybe not utter. There was still one old reliable that came to mind.
で、
Don't look at me like that. I'm perfectly aware that I'm an idiot. You don't have to rub it in. Even now, Kazuki said the possibility of everyone surviving wasn't quite zero. By believing in those words, I could hold on to hope. If I had hope, I could find the strength to go on. Yeah, that's right. I have to be stronger than this. But it was hard. It was very hard. A full 2 days had passed since Mr. Ochi left the camp. And as always, there were no signs of rescuers active nearby. Naturally, our teacher hadn't returned either. Is Mr. Ochi lying dead in a ditch somewhere? Maybe he's gotten to some safe place and just abandoned us here. What do we do if he never comes back? Amid a flurry of aimless speculation, we passed the days waiting for help to arrive. They didn't come today, but they'll definitely come tomorrow. They didn't come today either, but they'll probably come tomorrow. Man, all this, like, idiotic optimism is so ridiculous. Being optimistic is fine and all, but being this optimistic that you're, like, having to hold on to that glimmer of hope is just idiotic, I feel. Mr. Ochi said he'd get help, no matter what, when he left here. Not even half the group really believed it. But even so, somewhere deep down, every one of us was clinging to that glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he'd save us all. That maybe grew feebler by the day, eroded by cruel reality. Even as we came to understand that waiting would only bring a slow death, we clung to that shred of hope, piling speculation upon speculation. We built excuses out of sand. We convinced ourselves it was too early to decide. We stayed where we were and we waited for nothing. Trapped in oblivious lethargy, we lived for nothing but to avoid death. When our stomachs growled, we chewed on blades of grass and insects. When our throats were parched, we gulped from the first puddle of dirty water we saw. Naturally, it wasn't long before our stomachs turned violently against us. Somebody said chewing bamboo charcoal might be effective against diarrhea. Within hours, everyone's mouth was stained black. We searched and searched for anything edible. As long as it was organic and digestible, we ate it. Anything and everything. The rest of our time was spent lying in our sleeping bags, stroking our cramping, weak stomachs as we pretended to sleep. If we were lucky enough to fall unconscious, there was a brief respite from the pain. Did it skip like 2 days? No. The 12th day in the valley. Lately, I was waking every morning from dreams of food. Walking in the forest, I come across a trailer cart with broken wheels. When I draw close and look over the edge, there's a huge cardboard box full of canned food just sitting inside. Not just full, bursting at the seams. There are dozens of cans in that box. Beef boiled with soy sauce and ginger, mackerel cooked in miso, even canned peaches and pineapples. Untucking my shirt to make a pouch, I cautiously load it full of cans, making sure to stay alert and keep an eye on my surroundings. If I bring all this back, everyone will be able to eat until our stomachs are bulging. What a fantastic windfall. The looks on their faces when I come back. Not to worry, we have a can opener. But seriously, what was a bike cart doing all the way up in the mountains in the first place? A moment after the doubt flashes through my mind, I abruptly realize, oh, this is a dream. Anyway, I'll just take these back to camp now. Let's all gorge ourselves until we can't eat another bite. I tried to focus on that thought, but once the first realization hit, I could never manage to fall back into the illusion. That's called a lucid dream, Amane. Mostly, I would wake up with a start at this point. The instant my eyes opened, my stomach began gurgling violently, and the wrenching physical pain of it twisted my face into a miserable grimace. Even if it was a dream, I wish I'd at least taken a bite. When I wrapped up the story at this point, everyone would always laugh. You're such an idiot, Amane. I'd hide half the food. I'd give everybody one can, then hide the rest. I'd hide the whole stash and eat it in secret. The majority openly admitted something along these lines, then added with clear amusement that I was probably the only one stupid enough to come skipping right back without a second thought. It was now the 12th day. 12 days we'd spent living worse than stray dogs. Even among those who had been comparatively healthy, unmistakable symptoms of weakening were beginning to appear. The soft footsteps of death creeping steadily up behind us were growing impossible to ignore. Our nerves were rubbed raw from tension, our spirits timid and fearful. The first to be caught by our shadowy pursuer was Komori-san's pet, Akun, the Shih Tzu Allione. It wasn't a durable breed by nature, and what food we had simply wasn't suitable for a dog with a weak stomach. And so, having fallen into high fever during the days of relentless rain, Allione simply never opened his eyes again. He died quietly early this morning. Kneeling in front of the lifeless body, flat on its side with limbs stiffly extended, Komori-san removed the collar from Allione's neck and wrapped it around her thin wrist. That dog had been like a brother to Komori, but she didn't break into loud wails over its corpse. Her strangled sobs forced their way out from behind clenched teeth, seeming all the more piteous for it. Piteous? I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. I think so. Nobody could find anything to say to her. After a time, someone mumbled about at least giving the animal a proper burial. Kazuki immediately raised an objection.
あら、食べないの?
We'd all been vaguely thinking it, but deeply ingrained social norms had kept us from admitting that even to ourselves. And yet, Kazuki had blurted it out almost casually.
食べるって犬を？
そう、 この子に助けてもらうのよ。
At Kazuki's typically cold words, every one of us sharply drew breath. Eat. Yes, there was nothing in the world we wanted to do more at this point. The dog in front of us was nothing but a corpse. Now that it was dead, it was no longer a dog, it was meat. Would it be okay to eat a dog that died from sickness? It was Kazuki's suggestion, so presumably it was safe, but surely we couldn't start talking about this right in front of the grieving Komori-san, and this whole idea just felt so wrong. We all hesitated. The silence grew. To be honest, we wanted to eat it. But something inside us was still offering considerable resistance to the idea. Nobody could make up their own mind. All eyes settled on our last remaining formal authority figure, Captain Sakashida.
そうね。彼女の意見が正しいわ。食べましょう。
From the expression in the captain's face, those undeniably callous words must have tasted bitter in her mouth. Komori-san jerked her head up, as if stung, then slowly turned from side to side, looking into our faces one by one. Everyone averted their eyes from Komori's tearful gaze. Everyone except Kazuki, who met it firmly and gave her a small nod. Staring steadily down into those plaintive eyes, Kazuki murmured, "This is Alion's final duty." Komori-san's face crumpled as she slowly croaked out an answer.
わかりました。
Inhuman. The word was written clearly on Komori-san's face for anyone who cared to look. Even so, most of us let out a small, involuntary sighs of relief at our surrender.
だったら虫が湧く前に肉にした方がいいわね。
But that relief was short-lived. Kazuki's words once again left all of us frozen like stones. Right. If we were going to eat that corpse, we'd have to butcher it first. There was no choice. We had to pluck the hair from the dog's body and carve it up using a knife. But of course, no one wanted that job. Again, we looked to the captain. Biting her lower lip, the captain looked and turned to Kazuki. And finally, Kazuki closed her right eye and tilted her head slightly to the left.
皆さん、じゃんけんってご存知？
As a result of an impartial game of chance, the duty of processing the corpse fell on Koide-senpai. She tried briefly to resist, protesting, "I've never butchered a dog before." But of course, none of us had made a habit of carving up puppies either. So the argument didn't really hold together. I don't know if I've ever told you guys this, but I have a friend who actually killed stray cats in high school. It is pretty creepy, but yeah, I guess there's no actual authorities that can do anything because they were strays in the first place, right? This isn't Japan, this is a third world country. So people weren't really, like, you know, morally right. So even if someone knew about it, they weren't gonna report it to someone. I mean, I also knew it after the fact that he stopped doing it. But yeah. I wonder what would happen if I were stuck in a situation like this with that person. As the kitchen knife trembled dangerously in Koide's hand, the captain tried offering her some rough encouragement, along the lines of, "You're a doctor's daughter, aren't you?" To be honest though, it was a little hard to grasp what that had to do with anything. Visibly bracing herself, Koide gripped the knife firmly in both hands and took a step forward. But in that moment, her eyes met those of the dead dog below her, and she immediately burst into terrified tears. Naturally, the gallant hero Kazuki stepped in to save the day. Taking in her good hand the punishment rod she normally used to strike the pan for our morning wake-up call, she swung it down with all her might on the dog's head. Everyone gasped in shock at the gruesome act, many barely stifling screams. But if I start shrieking pointlessly, maybe I'm next. That irrational fear seized us all, and silence fell over the valley.
これでもうどこが目なのかわからないでしょ。頑張りなさい。
Meeting eyes with the dog is scary, is it? Then we'll just crush its eyes beyond recognition. It was about as elegant a solution as blowing off your jaw with a shotgun to cure a toothache.
絶対に無理。こんなのひどすぎるよ。私にはできない。
私がやってもいいけど、あなた、私がいなかったらどうするの？もし生き残ったのがあなた一人だったら、誰も助けてはくれないのよ。
As she spoke, Kazuki tossed her wooden sword aside, then took the kitchen knife from Koide's hands with a disdainful little snort. I feel like Kazuki... The stuff that she's saying is a bit... I don't know, I feel like she's wasting her energy. Teaching everyone, right? Making them think about what they can do alone and stuff like that. I feel like she's wasting her breath. Like I said, I think she's a bit too kind, right? If I were in her shoes, like I said, I'd probably just leave them alone because everyone would probably be more of a burden than not. Everyone's got their hands full with their own problems right now. No one's going to protect you. If you're weak, you're simply going to die first. Yeah, this is like advice, right? Basically. Why would she advise someone like this? I have no idea. Kazuki might not have said it point blank, but our meaning was all too clear. We studied the ground at our feet in silence. The strong eat the weak. Men and beasts, insects and plants, all live and die by that rule. Natural selection, true. And also the law of the jungle. Many hissed about Kazuki's cruelty in low voices, but her powerful words and unhesitating actions left no room for open objection. Kazuki possessed not only the decisive personality of a leader, but also the ability to inspire fear characteristic of a ruler. Everyone could only hang their heads and obey.
あなた、随分と素敵な人ね。
でしょ？あなたの彼氏にもベッドで同じことを言われたわ。お肉の用意ができたら真っ先にお声をかけますから、今は引っ込んでいていただけます？
Captain Sakashida turned abruptly on her heel and stalked away without another word.
強引だな。部長泣いてたよ。
あのまま喧嘩になるよりはマシでしょ。うるさい女を黙らせるにはああいうしかなかったのよ。
部長の彼氏って誰なの？
さあ、でも何の反論もしてこないところを見ると、心当たりのある存在がいるのか、もしくは彼氏がいないことをバカにされたと思って二の句を告げなくなったか、そのどちらかね。
もし部長が切れて飛びかかってきたらどうするつもりだったの？
あなたなら平気で犬の頭を潰すような女に襲いかかる？
I would.
つまりはそういうことよ。
全部計算していたのね。
Then again, she probably has a good grasp on the personality of everyone here.
それは買いかぶりすぎよ。部長に襲いかかられる確率もゼロではなかったわ。まあ、その時は無様に殴られてみんなの同情を集めようと思っていたけれど、生き残るために犬の頭を潰す女と個人的な感情を暴走させて怪我人を殴る女、みんなはどっちの味方になるかしら。あなた、どう思う？
怖い人だね、カズキ。
そうね、自覚はあるわ。私みたいな女は男の子にはモテないでしょうね、絶対。
A lot of people seem to like your personality, Kazuki. I'm a bit neutral. I badly wanted to scream if you're well aware. How about doing something about it? But I could anticipate her answer, no doubt delivered in her best nails on a chalkboard girly voice. I'm sorry, I just can't. It's too hard for little old me or some such. It felt as though I had maggots crawling down my spine at the mere thought. In any case, if there's a single man in the world who'd want to go out with this woman, I'd really like to meet him, so I can get him the help he needs. And so, Kazuki cleaned and gutted the dog, reducing it to meat. We soaked it in barbecue sauce from the communal stockpile and cooked its little body golden brown. The powerful aroma of grease and spicy sauce wafted through the air. We swallowed mouthfuls of warm drool again and again. Just a few days ago, that hunk of meat had been an energetic, adorable little dog, frolicking around Komori's feet. There was definitely a widespread feeling of guilt, but the sound of sizzling meat and the smell of dripping grease were irresistibly alluring. Even those who had whispered heatedly about Kazuki's inhuman cruelty couldn't overcome their own stomachs. When the meat was finally grilled and ready to be divided, they all swarmed up with plates in their outstretched hands. I was the one who carved the meat for distribution. The rear legs looked to be the choicest and most nourishing part of the body. Lopping off one with the kitchen knife, I placed it on Captain Sakashira's plate. The second went to Kazuki. After that, I divided the meat as evenly as I could between the rest of us. We had even carefully washed the internal organs and cooked them as well. After distributing it all, there was nothing left to do but greedily devour my share. It felt like such a very long time since I tasted meat. The first bite was so delicious that I went quite literally dizzy with bliss. My protein-starved tongue tingled as the animal fat slowly spread out inside my mouth, and my stomach squeezed tightly in on itself as though consciously trying to wring every particle of sustenance from the food. Of course, it was an ornamental lapdog, a toy breed. When distributed among the entire group, its body provided us with a mere mouthful of meat each. Even so, we all wept with joy at the nourishment, and as soon as the meat was gone, everyone began crunching away at the bones. We had assumed Komori would firmly resist the idea of consuming our pet's flesh, but in the end, she bit into her share of meat like all the rest, sniffling miserably the entire time. Tears blending with the mucus running from her nose, she ate. That one mouthful of meat kept us alive for today. I don't think we'll ever forget that taste for the rest of our lives, even if we want to. I don't think that actually kept you alive for today, to be honest. At the end of the day, that one mouthful of meat is probably what? 50 calories? At the end of the day, I think at this point, you guys are living purely on psychological willpower than anything. The 13th day in the valley. It happened far too suddenly. Komori-san, who'd seemed perfectly fine just a moment before, crumbled limply to the ground. For a moment, everyone who turned their head at the sound was simply dumbfounded.
Komori?
Kaneda-senpai called out to her partner, but Komori gave no response. Her body had begun to twitch convulsively on the ground. Komori hadn't fainted from lightheadedness or anemia. She was thrashing her body spasmodically, as if she had been possessed by some malevolent spirit. It was at once bizarre and terrifying to watch. Kaneda, suspecting an epileptic seizure, forcibly pinned down her partner's body from above in an attempt to keep her from hurting herself. Koide-senpai and I jumped up to answer Kaneda's call as the others looked on in shocked silence. We managed to move Komori-san onto a blanket, but the seizure continued. At Koide's anxious command, I ran off to find my own partner.
どう？原因は何なの？
倒れた時の様子はどうだったの？
わかんないよ。気がついたら地面に倒れてて、魚みたいにピクンピクンって暴れ出して。転換じゃないの？小学生の頃こんな風に倒れた子見たことあるよ。
転換の発作にしては長すぎるわね。
Komori's breathing was rapid. Her teeth chattered in her mouth, and her unfocused eyes swung randomly from left to right. Her hands and feet trembled strongly on a regular rhythm, as if matching the beating of her heart.
犬を食べたからトキソプラズマに感染したんじゃ。
トキソプラズマは猫よ。でも ありえないわけじゃないわね。
Toxoplasma is a common parasitic protozoan that spreads easily. So if you eat meat that's not properly cooked, there's a risk of infection. Normally, that's hardly cause for concern, but for those with badly weakened immune systems, it can cause serious illness and even death.
まともな免疫抗体があればこうはならないわよ。日和見感染症ね。
どうするの？このまま見ているしかないの？
検査のしようもないし、病名が分かったところで手の打ちようもないわ。せいぜい原因を特定して同じ過ちを犯さないように喚起するぐらいね。
原因は犬じゃないの？
犬はよく焼いてから食べたでしょ。考えにくいわね。小森さん、何か他に変わったものを食べたりしてなかった？
After a moment of thought, Kaneda's mouth fell open with a little ah.
そういえばなんか花の芽を食べてた。
花？何の花？
名前はわからないけど綺麗なピンク色の初めて見る花だった。これ食べられますかねって言ってその場で何個かつまんで食べてた。なんだろう、ジギタリス？
日本に生えてるかしら。自生が確認されたのは一度きりでしょ。
Kazuki laid a hand on Komori's trembling forehead.
熱があるわ。体内に侵入した病原菌を熱処理しようとしている証拠ね。水分をたっぷりと取らせて体を温かくしていっぱい汗をかかせるしかないわね。
それで治るの？
悪いけど他には何もできないのよ。何にせよこれに懲りたらよくわからないものをつまみ食いするのはやめなさい。
Under these starvation conditions, it was inevitable that our immune systems would grow weak. Recently, drinking water raw had become common practice, so no one wanted to waste time boiling it when they could be searching for food. And when foraging in the forest, many would pop even totally unfamiliar plants into their mouth if they looked vaguely edible. By now, diseases so mild that a normal person probably wouldn't even notice them were potentially life-threatening to us. That was how weak we'd grown. As we slowly carried Komori's quivering body into her tent, we could only grind our teeth at our powerlessness.
風見、ちょっといいかな。
We just left Komori to rest when Sakuma-senpai called out to us.
なんか息吹の様子がおかしいんだよ。
They're dropping like flies one by one. I had a very bad feeling about this. The moment we followed Sakuma into her tent, that presentiment was realized.
ねえ、今日は何日？私たちがここに来てから何日経ったのかな。
Wrapped up in her sleeping bag, Ibuki stared intently at a point on the tent's canopy, smiling slackly at nothing in particular as she spoke.
今日は何日？
今日は26日。ここに来て13日目よ。
そう。早く帰りたいな。
Even as she answered, Ibuki's eyes never turned toward us. The tone of her voice was vague, unfocused, almost like a sleepwalker conversing with her dream.
ちょっと出ようか。
As directed, we moved to leave the tent, but Ibuki immediately piped up.
ねえ、どこ行くの？私も行く。すぐ戻ってくるよ。おとなしく寝てな。今日は何日？26日だよ。そう。早く帰りたいな。
Sorry about that. I was playing with a pen, and it kind of hit my keyboard.
参ったよ。今朝からずっとあの調子なんだ。いつもならすぐに元に戻るのに、今日はもうずっとあんな感じだ。
Now I hit my mic. Sorry about that.
元に戻らなかったら、私どうすればいい？
どうすることもできません。ここには薬もなければ自己回復力を上げるだけの需要もないんです。
このまま腐るに任せるしかないのか。 見ていることしかできないのか。
申し訳ありません。
君が悪いんじゃないさ。無理を言っているのは私だ。すまなかったね。
いえ。
Sakuma-senpai's powerless attempt at a smile conveyed only resignation and defeat, made all the more pitiful by her swollen face. It wasn't a flesh swelling of a fever. Her face was drained of all color, her ghastly pale cheeks visibly rough and dry. Oh, give me a sec here. Someone's actually outside my door. And I am back. Sorry about that. There was a package outside. And I also came back with some lychee syrup. 0 calories. Because I would typically drink some coffee at this hour. But I got myself some 0 calories syrup. It is a bit late. It's like 6 p.m. right now. So I don't really want to drink coffee. But alright, continuing on. She was blinking constantly throughout our conversation. It may have been difficult merely to keep her eyes open behind those bloated cheeks.
佐久間さんも栄養失調が顔に出ています。気をつけてください。
そうだね。気をつけるよ。
Exactly how was she supposed to be careful about starving when there was no damn food? Sakuma seemed mature in refraining from yelling the obvious retort in Kazuki's face. But quite possibly she simply no longer had the energy. Just how long would the situation last? Mentally, physically, in every possible way, we were being taxed beyond our capacity to endure. How long could we possibly hold it together under such circumstances? Even Kazuki, our acknowledged authority on mental toughness, could no longer fully hide her fatigue. Her youthfully framed face, burdened with that accumulated exhaustion, seemed to have aged somehow. Gently closing her eyes, Kazuki breathed a brief sigh, then proceeded to depress me still further.
実はここだけの話、桜井先輩と広岡さんも相当にまずいのよね。
Sakurai had initially been recovering fairly well, but our unsanitary environment and inability to adequately disinfect her wound proved catastrophic. She was beginning to exhibit symptoms of sepsis, almost certainly caused by bacteria invading through her wound. Sepsis. She was now running a high fever with a consistently elevated heartbeat. She had tripped over her tongue when she tried to speak, and her limbs were routinely racked by brief, painful muscle spasms, as if her body was trying to contract. She needed antibiotics, and soon. Hiroka-san was no better. In fact, she was worse. Her debilitation had progressed to the point that she no longer showed any response to our voices. It all came down to inadequate treatment, compounded by worsening malnutrition. The dog had been our only halfway decent meal in days. Otherwise, we were getting by on cooked snails, wild grasses, and our gruel. Really nothing more than faintly colored water with a few grains of boiled rice floating at the bottom. Even minor injuries couldn't heal on such a diet. On our first day stranded in this ravine, we ate fluffy white rice, steaming from the cooker. I couldn't get that memory out of my mind. Back then, we gobbled the rice down without a second thought. Even had the nerve to complain about our coarse side dishes. Just remembering it made me want to scream at the pampered luxury of it all. We were so starved for sugar that tea, made from the skins of onions, almost tasted sweet to our tongues. But then again, our initial yearning for sweets only lasted for the first carefree week or so. At some point, we'd begun to crave salt far more than sugar. By now, we'd been reduced to licking the rust that formed on the wrecked frame of our bus after the days of rain. I had reached my absolute limit. When I crawled into bed at night, I hesitated to close my eyes, afraid I'd never open them again. But then again, maybe it would be better that way. If I let my eyelids fall shut, I would sink deeply into blissful oblivion. If my heart would then quietly stop beating, wouldn't it be a blessing? I couldn't help but feel that a death without suffering would be a happier fate than to struggle on like this. But whenever I expressed these weak thoughts out loud, Kazuki would scold me.
まだ諦めるのは早いわ。
Kazuki whispered those words forcefully, as if trying to convince herself they were true. It seemed too cruel to fire back, then how long do we have to endure? How long before we can finally give up? I could find no further words, and silence settled on the tent. The 14th day in the valley. When morning came, Kazuki struck the bottom of the pan at our normal wake-up time, but there were no signs of activity from within the tents. It wasn't that the others weren't awake, they simply couldn't get up. Recently, just standing upright was exhausting. It wasn't rare for someone to spend the majority of the day lying in their sleeping bag. Even when we attempted to move, it would often prove impossible. Every time we tried to stand, our joints would scream in pain. If we pulled ourselves upright by clinging to a tree or rock, our knees would be shaking so hard that we could barely walk. Even so, as the sun rose and warmed the valley, those who could still move came crawling slowly out of their tents, basking in the rays of morning light. We resembled nothing so much as a lethargic pack of iguanas escaped from the Galapagos Islands. For some reason, it felt as though the mere touch of the sun on our skin gave us some small boost of energy. Of course, it was mostly an illusion. Our stomachs were still empty. But either way, moving around aimlessly would be a waste of calories, so we all found our seats in the sun and kept still. It was tempting to just flop down in the spot and close your eyes, but the cold stone beneath us stole body heat quickly, so lying down would burn a surprising amount of energy. Staying awake and sitting quietly was the best way to conserve our strength. We sat on the hard ground as if rooted to the spot, unable to do anything but silently agonize over our individual fates. I wish they give you a lot more CG in this route. Kinda sad they only have the standing CG of everyone. I've got to do something. How can I survive this? The thought churned endlessly around our heads, but merely focusing our nourishment-starved brains on a question took all our effort. Actually producing an answer was beyond our power. And yet, even now, we were still human beings. We still hadn't broken the absolute minimum rules.
まだ地獄ではない。まだ生き残る価値のある世界だわ。
At my side, Kasuki murmured those words to herself slowly and deliberately, as if confirming that she was still firmly conscious, still able to speak.
でもどうかしらね。もう時間の問題かもしれない。
I followed her gaze around the area. Everyone was staring goggle-eyed into the distance, their pale, slack faces shining greasily in the morning sun. There was something dangerous in the air. Given a small push in the wrong direction, it felt as though even our humanity would instantly crumble beneath us.
ユージ。今なんて？弟の名前よ。風見ユージ？そう。それが私の弟の名前。会ってみたいな。生きて帰ることができたら紹介してあげるわ。きっと気に入るはずよ。楽しみだな。きっとだよ。ええ、約束するわ。
That afternoon, Mr. Ochi returned from his escape attempt to rejoin us on our gradual, passive slide toward death. He was completely emaciated. His sunken eyes were as dark and hollow as those of a wild animal. But more than lamenting his failure, the group was overjoyed at his return. I see. He failed. We were back to the drawing board yet again. That was a heavy, if somewhat abstract, disappointment. Even so, the return of our only adult male was no small relief. Man, it's so weird that he would actually go back rather than try to go and see how far he could go. I find that quite weird that he would go back rather than, go forward and die in the forest. I don't know. I guess he just doesn't want to die yet. Not to say that our teacher's presence caused any dramatic changes in the situation. As always, we were desperately short of food. If anything, practically speaking, Mr. Ochi's return translated to nothing more than another mouth to feed, worsening our already meager daily rations. That evening, having entered the large tent to check up on the wounded, I noticed that Hiroka-san had quietly stopped breathing. 2 weeks after Shikanai, Ozawa, and Okabe's deaths, we had our fourth casualty. Hiroka had died lying in the sleeping bag in which she'd spent the last 14 days of her life, her eyes and mouth half open. It was a gruesome sight, but there wasn't any real agitation among us. We'd all been prepared for this, even expecting it. I was no exception. Rather than grieving the death of my friend, I gazed down at her corpse in a stupor. A single thought was swirling relentlessly through my dull mind. Are we going to eat this one as well? When a living thing dies, it becomes food. Kazuki had said that was only natural. So then, her too? I wasn't the only one suspecting as much. Without a doubt, the others were thinking the exact same thing. If Captain Sakashida or Mr. Ochi had suddenly said, "Alright, let's eat her," we would probably have looked into each other's faces for reassurance, then offered tacit acceptance by silence. We would have eaten our friend's corpse. At some point, all eyes had turned toward our teacher. But Mr. Ochi said only, "I'll dig the grave," quietly bringing his hands together in front of Hiroka-san's corpse. We're not going to eat her? As the words floated irrepressibly to the surface of my mind, the trance finally broke, and I shivered in shock and revulsion. What was I thinking? Of course we were burying her. A human being eating another human being is unforgivable, no matter what. We must have been going a little soft in the head. Right. Our friend had died, and we were upset. We'd lost our heads from the shock. That was all. Our shoulders sagged to learn our stomachs would go unfilled, but all the same, we heaved sighs of relief. Without a single word of objection, we silently watched Mr. Ochi walk down into the forest to bury Hiroka's remains. I'm vile. I'm a vile, disgusting excuse for a human being. The shame welled up so suddenly and so heavily inside me that I couldn't contain my tears. Lowering myself shakily down onto the hard ground, I broke into wretched, violent sobs. Alright, I think this is a good time to end the episode. Yeah, things are not looking good for Amane, but we know what was gonna happen at the start of the flashback anyway. Everyone else is just gonna die. Thing is though, what Amane said about eating the corpse of the people that died, these kinds of things actually happen for survivors that I think that go like hiking on like super high mountains, like Mount Everest and stuff like that. Or people that got stranded, say during like a plane crash. When there's no food, when people die, you do consider that as food. And not to be disrespectful, of course, right? You can still be human even after you eat human, as long as mentally you know that you're doing something bad. As long as you don't normalize what you're doing, you're still human. You're doing it to survive. Is it wrong for you to want to survive? I mean, it's any life's nature, or any life's instinct. Any living being's instinct. Whether it be humans, like animals, plants. Like, we want to survive. I personally can't really condemn people that eat other people for survival, if that were to happen to them. But you know, like maybe even then, I'm not exactly like what do you call what the majority would like. The majority of people probably wouldn't agree with what I'm thinking.
セーブしますか？
But alright. Damn, we actually went through 8 days throughout this whole episode. I actually did not expect this this whole route to be this fast. Like, I think we are almost at the end of Angelic Howl. I think we're stopping at day 18, I think? I could be wrong. I think Amane's route might be done in about 1 or 2 more episodes. But then again, we saw what happened with Machina's route. My estimation is just insanely wrong. Hopefully, my estimation this time is not that wrong. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the episode. Give it a like if you like it. Subscribe if you want some more. Nothing in the Patreon except for early access for now, like I said. But yeah. Hopefully this one I don't have to render so that I can have the full audio just mixed in. But other than that, hope you guys have a nice and enjoyable day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time.